Hi, everyone. Welcome to Cortisol, the podcast that tackles topics that tend to raise your cortisol level and that are close to your heart. I am Gail Rago, and today I'll be the host for this very special episode, the first one that marks this trilogy around the topic of toxicity at work. Today, as you'll see also behind us, this is a really great format because it is a live podcast format where we have a live studio audience with us. I like calling it a live studio audience as if I'm on one of those talk shows. But later, after I ask Shweta some really important questions around toxicity at work and how we know if a situation is toxic, we will be answering questions from the floor, and we hope that many of these questions will also be ones that perhaps are raised during this conversation. So first of all, I have to introduce, Shweta will introduce herself, but I want to at least welcome and thank Shweta. Shweta Kulkarni Van Biesen is the founder of A Better Brussels, an awareness campaign and resource hub for those affected by toxic work environments in the EU policy bubble and beyond. So a very, very key and important guest to have in our first episode. Shweta, welcome, and thank you so much for accepting our invitation and being our first guest on this show.
Thank you so much. Absolutely a pleasure to be here.
Brilliant. Well, let's jump right into it. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and about the reasons that motivated you to start A Better Brussels?
Sure, yeah. So just so everyone is aware, I'm Indian, I'm American, and a confused Belgian. I have been in Belgium for about 12 years now. And I started my career in computer science, and then I jumped into communications. And I have worked in communications since, so about 12 years now in Brussels. And I've worked within the policymaking space, but also outside it. And the reason I started A Better Brussels, because I've been through it myself. And I think I went through it myself back to back. So 1, 2, 3 employers later, I was starting to think to myself that the problem is really me. And maybe it is me. And I don't want to say that the problem is never me, but I was asking myself, what am I doing wrong? Where am I missing? And it also took me to get coaches and psychologists to kind of try to decipher what was going on with me. And then, the basic thing that we do in Brussels, which is just have informal coffee chats, go out for a drink with people. I was starting to hear too many times, or almost every time that I spoke to people were saying, hey, look, this is happening, this is happening, this is happening. Can you believe it? Can you believe it? And I just did what I do for my own sanity, which is started writing. And when I started writing, more and more people got in touch with me and said, what you're saying makes sense. I've been through it myself. So then I said, okay, let's start thinking about what I could possibly do. And one of the things that I want to share, especially with this audience, is that a lot of times when you're going through toxic work environments, it's horrible. But there's nothing more like seeing other people go through it and feeling like you're an enabler because you're not doing something about it, So when I was going through toxic work environments myself, I was also speaking to my colleagues then that aren't we enablers by not speaking up or by speaking up and not doing anything about it? So all of that stuff, really horrible 4.5, 5 years that I went through this stuff, that got me to say, I need to do something about it and maybe possibly have a systematic conversation around toxic workplaces.
Thanks for that. So if you had to tell us a little bit more about what A Better Brussels is and what it does, how would you summarize it?
Sure. I mean, like it says on the first fold of the website, we are an awareness campaign. I do not want to overpromise and underdeliver. I want to say that I'm going to do what I can, which is I'm a comms professional. I'm going to do what I can, which is raise awareness around this topic. And I also started to feel bad that a lot of resources like coaches or psychologists sits with us, each and individual, each and every person sort of keeps it within ourselves. So why not kind of take that and create a resource hub where those kind of coaches are shared? And the incredible thing is, by doing this work for a Better Brussels, I've started to notice that there are so many other initiatives that do that. And second thing is that needs of all of us are extremely different. So I've come across one person who said, Shweta, I was recently, as an adult, diagnosed with ADHD. I have a psychologist who is helping me in Mechelen, who understands what it is to be working with ADHD in a toxic work environment. That is such a specialty that I would have never be exposed to, and then why keep it to myself? So in short, yes, A Better Brussels is an awareness campaign, but a resource hub, hopefully, for people who are in desperate need of help.
Absolutely. I can see this with so many things. Even just finding a good dentist in Brussels can be a challenge. So having a resource hub is definitely a good place to start. Thanks so much for that. So before we dive into a lot of specific questions, I think what we should start with is we talked about mental health, and I talked about burnout, and we use the toxic word a lot. Can't wait for the toxic Britney song to play later. But what do we mean by toxicity, especially in the context of a professional environment?
So I would love to say that I am an expert and this person who has a PhD who has done their research. So I want to be very, very careful on how I define toxicity. But I have done a little bit of work, and my husband is a psychologist, so he has been helping me with this, and is to, within the EU policy space that we work in, we have to recognize the fact that toxicity stems from power. And toxic behaviors are seriously persistent bullying, persistent harassment, persistent extreme micromanaging. So if you're in the policy making space and you have a boss or a colleague who asks you to have your emails reviewed before they are sent out, and you are a mid to a senior level person, toxic. So to answer your question in short, so toxicity, and I would encourage people to go to the Better Brussels website to get into, deeper into what does toxicity mean in a given context like ours, which is the EU policymaking space. But I would love for people to also be free and answer that question for themselves, because what the stats say, what data says is one thing, but what people's lived experiences are very different. So really don't want to say this is, and if it doesn't fit into this box, then it's not,
You've probably heard a lot of testimonies, and perhaps today also we'll hear some real examples of what people in the room are going through. But what are the kinds of toxic behaviors that you've found are the most recurrent in workplaces?
I would say that one of the things that I want to talk about is the fact that Better Brussels hosted recently 3 listening sessions. And one of the things we did during those listening sessions is ask people, how do they define toxicity? What do they, what are some of the stories that they want to share? And one of the things that was very clear in those conversations is policy experts are king and everybody else is second. So legal experts are king and everybody else is second. So there were so many, but I will just summarize to 2 because you asked, is they basically said that because we work in this space, it's like this power that is given to policy experts, and maybe rightly so, they should have it, because they have this incredible know-how, an incredible network, and a lot of them are extremely charismatic and speak the language of the policymakers we're trying to reach. But that is giving them incredible power and making the rest of the professions second-class citizens. And I don't want to say that that shouldn't be the case. I think management, influencers or people in management schools have always taught us that there is so much that an organization can bring together. So policy expertise is beyond belief important. But that doesn't mean they have to put they have to lift themselves up at the expense of other people, like at the expense of putting other people down. So I would love for organizations to think, hey, look, what do I bring? What do you bring? And how can we deliver on an organization's objective together? So that was one thing that came up. And I'm sorry for the long answer, but the second one that came up was absolutely micromanaging, which is stories around how so many people think that they are short of asking for a hall pass to go to the bathroom. Like, that's how far micromanaging is happening, because this sense of control of the narrative and the control, it really should make policymakers think about what are you doing wrong that you're having such an incredible control on people within your organization. So those are the two things that kept coming up.
Sounds very, very relatable. In one of the organizations that I was in. So I think this is also very special for comms people that we both are, because I think comms needs a special therapy group to deal with the abuse that we have to put up with, especially from our policy colleagues who think that we are just their butlers. I'm sorry to say. So yeah, that sounds so relatable. And I'm so glad you talked about the P word, which is power. Because so often when you go to coaches or when you talk about this kind of abuse, if you don't talk about power and you don't try to challenge or find strategies to challenge it, it's very difficult to get actual change. But in this case, in this organization that I was with, it was so funny because I think there were like 4 policy people, and they had this huge room with a bouncy ball and like a carpet zone. And then the rest of us, like 8 comms and campaigns people in a tiny little office, we had to take turns almost sitting on the chairs because there weren't enough, you know. So it was just such an obvious example of who holds the power in an organization. And I feel like that is really that's shameful, and it should be embarrassing for also our management and our leadership. Because I will also argue, sure, policy people do good things. They're speaking with policy makers, but who is going to convert your policy paper into something that people will actually read? It's the comms people. And do you know the amount of work it takes to take a legal text and convert it into a sexy social media post? No, many people don't. So I would argue that all of us in our roles and responsibilities at work should absolutely be given the credit and the praise.
Yeah, and you know, I had to say this multiple times, is that why are we in competition? I am not here to hurt you or undermine your policy work. We are in this together. We are part of one organization, and we are all ultimately trying to, do what's best for our customers, like the people who are paying the bills. And that may be different people, that may be companies if you're working in a trade body. So I just think, I don't know why there is this sense of competition. We are all on the same team. Why?
I think that's another great example of what is a red flag. If you feel like you're constantly being pitted against each other, your own colleagues, especially in the nonprofit sector, that is a huge red flag. Why is there an environment, as you say, where you feel like you're competing rather than working together So I think that also is something that I can really relate to. Okay, there are definitely more testimonials, especially on LinkedIn, about people who have suffered from different forms of toxicity at work. So this is, I think, quite a classic question. Do you think it's because we just see more toxic behavior happening more often? Or is it because more people actually dare to talk about workplace toxicity more openly?
So I've had this question asked a couple of times, and I also wondered myself, why are so many organizations now coming up? And I think because of the thing that I mentioned first is, I think it's one thing to go through it yourself and figure out a way out of your toxic situation, but I think it's something else and probably worse for some people when they feel like enablers when they don't do something about it happening to other people. So I think the people who have started organizations like the Good Enough Company, the Harassment Support Network, Empower EU, these are organizations who are almost everybody there has a day job. Like we all have day jobs and we're doing this on the side in the evenings. And a lot of us are just like, you know what, I went through this, but I just don't want to like let it be and be one of the multiple people who are just staying quiet on this. And also we are, I mean, I don't know about the others and I really can't speak for the others, but I think we also want one space that is our own where we don't ask for approvals and want to run organizations the way we would like to run them. So I really encourage this audience that is here and the audience that is watching later on is if you can, and I don't want to make it seem like this is everybody's cup of tea, but have a space for yourself where you're not asking for approvals. Because a lot of times when we project out on what somebody else should do, a lot of times it's really good to test it out yourself, you know? And it's a beautiful space. Like you mentioned, you know, being a consultant, there's nothing like it. I absolutely agree. It's not for everyone, but I have to say that there's nothing like a space, a little tiny space, and it can be exercise or whatever else you want it to be, but that is your very absolutely own, and you don't have like 25 million people that you have to ask approvals of.
Thanks so much for sharing that. Okay, there was a specific tool, it's called the introspective self-assessment tool that you developed through A Better Brussels. That's meant to help bosses to understand their leadership style and what is called, am I a toxic boss? It is a pretty well thought out tool that could really benefit a lot of people. But I think the first question that comes up in most people's mind, including mine, is are they actually being used by the very specific toxic bosses out there that will benefit most from this tool? So did you receive any feedback from this, from toxic bosses potentially, or from people who have used this tool and who have decided to actually question themselves and do better after?
Yeah, good question. And this one is going to need a long answer, but I'll keep it short. But so to answer your question, one of the things that I was trying to do is do what we do in communications, right? We segment the people we are trying to reach. One is the group that is never going to be convinced. Let them go. They can live in their bubble, fine. There's that group in the middle which hasn't made up their mind. And then there's a group at the end that is like completely convinced. They're like, they want to be better leaders. They're going out there, taking online courses. They're looking at which business school I should be part of or what management training I should get, right? So in these three groups, I said, okay, so if I already have the people who are convinced coming to the Better Brussels listening sessions, right? But the people in between who are like, dude, I have way too much on my plate. I don't have time for this. And what is this bullshit that Shweta is talking about through A Better Brussels? But maybe I'm a little bit interested, you know? So I was really catering for that middle group. And then I said, okay, I cannot make it sound like you're a toxic boss. So I said, okay, how can I pose it in a way that is a bit more welcoming to do this self, reflection or kind of be a little bit self-aware. So that's why, and of course, thanks to my husband who is a psychologist, so he kind of said like, okay, let's draft it in a way that is people are slightly open to it, while keeping in mind that the Brussels folks really don't have time for this. So make it extremely short. So that's why it's only 2 minutes long. And that it immediately kind of gives them an answer that is completely private. So nobody has to know. I don't even know. Like, I don't have any data other than 500 unique people took the test, So for me, yes, it's a very good sign that people are using the test. But we are also operating in an environment where the people who attend, like today, those who are attending, are most probably are people who are the victims or people who are not really perpetuating toxic behaviors, right? So here we are really still speaking to the convinced crowd. So I'll give you another very good example that when we launched the Am I a Toxic Boss, two people messaged me on LinkedIn to say, hey, Shweta, do you know that one or two of the people listed on your how can EU bosses do better report. One of those two people have shown toxic tendencies. So you have somebody who has shown toxic tendencies listed as somebody who helped you draft that report. And I said, obviously I was like, okay. But one of the things I want to say to the crowd and also to those watching is that I would love for a Better Brussels to not be a closed group where a lot of us are just in an echo chamber of our own, where we come off as being, we have it all figured out. Because toxic work environments and really enabling leadership is a work in progress. It's constant work. It's evaluating what works for one team member of yours, what works for another. So I'm trying to create an organization or an awareness campaign that really, is open to people with that slight little bit of self-awareness or consciousness to ask themselves the question, am I a toxic boss? Am I that colleague that a Better Brussels is talking about always? And those are the only people I'm trying to reach. So I would love, and I'm going to watch this camera. My former boss, toxic colleague, you know who you are, okay? You know why I started a Better Brussels. If you ever want to come to a listening session of a Better Brussels, if you don't, that's fine. But if you want to even take that self-assessment for yourself and ask yourself the question, please do. Because sometimes it's just asking yourself, like, am I on the right track? Like, am I on the right track only because I think it will make you a better person to help you deliver the organization's objectives that and also the people around you will be happy. The people around you will stop talking about your organization in this way. That's why I call it an organization. So please don't come sue me because of defamation. But I'm just telling you, like, people are talking. And Brussels, we talk. Okay? So take the self-assessment, ask yourself the question. It takes 2 minutes. So when you're like on your bio break, you can take the self-assessment if you don't have time. Back to you.
Thanks for that. Thanks for that. I can really appreciate the tension that you talked about with trying to bring in possibly toxic bosses or people who have engaged in toxic behavior, but also knowing that there is no black and white situation where everyone on one side is perfect and everyone on the other side is horrible. And trying to find that balance is very tricky. And I have often seen this in many kinds of social justice spaces. I'm not saying that there's necessarily one way that's better than the other, but if we are so closed to people who are interested in change, then we don't allow people to get better. And yet at the same time, it is equally important to listen to feedback and to challenge people. I've also been in situations or projects where people who speak about themselves being intersectional and feminist end up being the ones who cause harm to other people, or, as you have said, end up being bystanders while harm is being created. And it is a tricky thing that, we are all trying to navigate. So maybe all of us should give each other grace as well. Better have a platform and a tool that exists that allows this, and better invite through some form or the other people who are willing to do that than say, if you're not 100% amazing and wonderful, and let's be honest, we live in toxic societies, we live in capitalistic societies, none of us are perfect. And if we had to, any kind of role, including being a manager, is also about trial and error. Yes, unfortunately, sometimes it ends up being that the people you manage end up being your guinea pigs, and that should not be the case. But I've also learned through my mistakes. The bad decisions I made the first time I was a manager, I made sure never to fucking repeat those again with my team. So we all are going through a learning journey, and that's also important, I think, to keep in mind.
Correct. Yeah, absolutely.
All right, moving on to the next question. Oftentimes in professional environments that are becoming toxic, it's because unhealthy or unfair patterns have been allowed for weeks or months or much, much longer. And because structurally inside the company or organization, there was no one to safeguard against this kind of behavior or eventual degradation. So, talking more about solutions or how to spot and avoid this, how can we avoid this happening? What systems or processes could be put in place to avoid organizations and work cultures eventually devolving into this toxicity?
Yeah, yeah. Very pertinent question, especially in the Brussels policy space, because I think we can all agree that the organizations in Brussels policymaking space in particular are, you have a assistant to the CEO who's also an office manager who also has been given HR responsibilities. So that's the environment we are working in, right? So we are like this one person who has, during the interview, probably said this little thing about, I have some HR training, gets all these responsibilities. So that's the reality of the organizations operating in Brussels. There are, of course, and I don't want to generalize, there are, of course, organizations that do have a proper HR person. I also want to point out that we are in Belgium. Belgium has one of the best anti-bullying, anti-harassment laws, right? So I would love to, on one side, and that came up in the listening sessions, is that don't like HR, like Brussels-based policy organizations need like HR person, HR processes, Sure, I have worked in multinationals before. I have had proper HR teams. Sorry, HR, but absolutely useless. Have not helped me. They have really been like company resources, like CRs rather than HRs, right? So I was like, okay, so do we bring that here into the policy space and make sure, and oh my God, the HR people in Brussels organizations are going to hate me, so sorry. But as I apologize for the comms profession, I think HR people, legal people, you all need to start apologizing for your own professions, okay? But I leave it up to you guys to do it. But what I'm trying to say is that I don't know if having HR people within Brussels organizations is a solution. Like you did earlier, I really hold account to these incredible laws that are already in place for somebody to implement them. Okay, like yesterday was Safer Internet Day. And I heard everybody and their organizations talk about the amount of work that they're doing around safer internet. I can tell you there's so much stuff, and I come from the online safety space. There's incredible stuff ongoing on making the online safety space safer. We are not absolutely there yet. We haven't have it all figured out, but there is incredible amount of conversation, and I can elaborate on this some other time, but there's incredible conversations around this. Today, in the physical space, we have Giselle Picot, I think her name is, from France, who recently won the case around the horrible sexual abuse and harassment that she went through, where she's calling out a European, because we listen to Europeans, who said, shame needs to change sides. And if that's happening on the physical space, around a woman's personal space, why is this not happening on the mental space? So for those really, really trying to listen to a European and an incredible woman who is such a shining example of saying, why should I be ashamed as a victim? There's something for us to say, okay, if she can speak up and say that, why can't we do that for a mental space, But like you mentioned, again, mental space of people, not that much funding or, work done. But mental health of the economy, bring me the money, right? So if that's the case, then let's call it, I really, like comms, we can help you with the branding. Let's call it not mental health of European citizens, maybe we call it mental health of the European economy or something. Even the camera person is smiling. You're right? Okay, anyway. So what I'm trying to say is that, we are in an extremely privileged space, living and working in Belgium with incredible anti-bullying and anti-harassment laws. I think it's just a matter of implementing it and doing what we are the conversations that are happening around online safety space to come into the physical space around people's mental health. That's it.
I really love what I heard, which is shame needs to change sides. Shame needs to change sides. Almost like a tongue twister, sorry. But that's, I think, such a key thing. And I think that's why we're having conversations about things that have only benefited a certain group of privileged, powerful people to make us ashamed and quiet and make these topics taboo. So definitely, I think this is the kinds of conversations that will hopefully change that. But I think we have a couple more questions. So let's see here. The last question before we actually open up to the floor. So this is great. We're doing great on time. Wonderful. Look at us. Sometimes it's nice to give a little pat on the back. My therapist would be so proud. Yeah. So my last question to you is, what are the essential characteristics of a healthy boss in opposition to a typically toxic one that we've been discussing?
Oh, yeah, good point.
All of you, put your thinking hats on now to make the toxic healthy. Which one is it?
So I think, I would say there are two attributes that I would love for bosses, including me, to have in order for us to be standout bosses in the EU policymaking space. One is really looking at ourselves as enabling forces for our teams. I would love for everybody to understand that, hey, look, comms is not king, and neither is policy, and neither is a legal counsel. We are all like the best way I can explain it is, policy is just one pillar of a house that the house is standing on. Comms is another one, Legal is another one. Like HR is another one. The assistant, the office manager in the office, the CEO's assistant is another one. Like we all have a role to play together in order for us to be able to deliver an organization's objective. And that can be anybody. If you're a trade body, if you're standing up for an industry, I think that's even more crucial, because you're asking yourself, how can I stand up and speak and talk about the position of this industry to a policy is just as important as regulatory affairs, as legal affairs, as market research, for example, or comms, So I would love, to answer your question, I would love for everybody to start thinking that we are an enabling force and one of the multiple pillars that make an organization in order for them to deliver a given objective. I have this rule for myself, is that, and also this is something that we're trying to implement in a Better Brussels, which is, it's so much easier to say what other people should do. And especially at a podcast like this or at an event like this, where there's a speaker and we are la about what somebody else should do. And hence the Am I a Toxic Boss self-assessment. There'll be a few more self-assessments coming up. But I think it's a lot about asking ourselves the question, sure, as I preach other people what they should do, what kind of boss do I want to become? Like, who am I as a person when I see other people suffering because in this organization I'm a favorite, but this other person isn't? So I hope that, so to answer your question, yeah, that is what an enabling person would make a really good boss.
Thanks so much. I had to start taking notes because I wanted to, since I have the microphone, might as well abuse my power. And I also wanted to add a few things that came to mind. One thing is, we have talked a lot about toxic bosses, but colleagues, and you also were referring to this, equally can make your life hell in a work environment, whether it's because of competition or jealousy or oftentimes inferiority, can often lead to situations that are very toxic. I've also had situations like that where there is bullying from colleagues. It's horrible. So I also just wanted to name that it's not necessarily only the bosses. I think there should absolutely be responsibility that we attach to leaders and managers to make sure that workplaces are safe, because that is part of their job, a big part of their job. But absolutely work spaces can become or can continue being toxic because of toxic colleagues, whether they are in management or not. And again, it's a question of power. And I also say this because you may not be a manager and maybe you have no intention of being a manager, but we can all lead in many different ways and we can all be solutions or those toxic agents in our organizations, in our working relationships and outside of it. And therefore, taking a look inside is sometimes a good place to start before we start to finger point or say this or not that. And I also wanted to say, I have seen many, many bad bosses in Brussels, sadly, but I've also seen some amazing ones. And I think this is healthy, but maybe it's a little bit too healthy because one of my first bosses in Brussels, who I love, and she really is like family, so that's why I say it sounds a little cringe, but she's literally my next door neighbor now because I love her. We love each other that much. But what made her a wonderful boss was that she was just so incredibly human. When I was struggling, she was there for me first. She cared about my well-being. She was the one who said, Gail, it's time for you to be promoted, not me. That is what a good manager looks like. And I think it's important to also say, that's bad. But you know what is good? This. Because otherwise it's really difficult to compare. And similarly, something that I always admire in any person in a working situation, but especially a manager, and that's something I try to incorporate when I manage people, is people who can admit that they've made mistakes and people who can give praise. It doesn't matter that that person did it doesn't matter. I always say, we both looked at it. We've both, have shared feedback. How does it hurt you to give a little bit of appreciation to other people? It takes nothing. And yet it brings so much joy, so much unity into a team. So people, including bosses, who can admit mistakes, who can say, shit, you're right. And to say, I'm so grateful. I could never do this without you guys. Small things, but they make such a huge impact. So these are some things to look out for in good bosses and good leaders. Okay, great. And I feel like that's a really great note to open the floor to the audience. We are going to definitely pass the mic and we'll bring a chair over in a second to see if anyone has questions for Shweta.
My question is, to what extent in a work environment that is toxic, but also where the toxicity is very normalized, for instance, working on weekends or extra hours and so on, to what extent you're able actually to have the agency to not reproduce it?
Oh, wow. So I think one of the things that I learned through going through my experience is what I didn't do. And that is setting those boundaries myself, and when you're going through it, when you're like in a podcast situation or a panel like this, we as speakers really make it seem like we have it all figured out, but it really isn't. It was extremely difficult space when the coach told me, Shweta, it's not what you didn't do. Like, it's you, of course. I mean, it's of course them, like, for putting you through this, right, for sure. But it's also you, because you from the get-go didn't set those boundaries, didn't say no to working. And it's easy for her to say as a coach, right? But it kind of was like eye-opening to say, oh shit, there are really, for this audience, I really urge you to remember this thing, is that there are things that are not in your control, which is your bosses or your colleagues' behavior. But what is in our control are things that are the boundaries we set, the things that we do. Now, it's easy for me to say because a lot of times we will lose our jobs in case we don't work on the weekends or we don't act like we are super busy or whatever, right? So please handle with absolute care. But I think the main thing is get out, get out, but like practice setting those boundaries in the shit organization you're in the shit situation. Because every time you practice speaking up and having that agency, you get better in your next organization, and might as well like practice on the shit organization.
That's great advice, Shweta. Actually, that's literally the case because I told you people around me are falling like flies. I actually have a friend who did exactly that. They realized they had reached burnout stage, and that's the thing about burnout. It doesn't come knocking like, "Hey, you're burnt out now." No, it's like slowly, it's insidious, and that's how it gets you. Because I was like, no, no, no. I know what burnout is. It ain't gonna get me. Well, I was wrong. So you gotta it really sneaks up on you. But in this case, my friend, went on leave for burnout and came back, gradually starting at one day. And that's exactly what he did. He started to put boundaries that he hadn't before. And of course, people weren't necessarily happy, but at least they weren't verbally because he had a doctor's note or he had, he was able to say, no, this is what my doctor says, so I'm only going to work like 2 days a week. And he also could see the impact that it had on other colleagues who noticed him putting boundaries and noticed that he was able to survive despite that. And somehow some of them felt emboldened to set boundaries for themselves. And others, obviously, probably there was also resentment. But he literally is practicing no, I'm going to learn how to set boundaries here. And those are skills that are going to last you a lifetime. Because, I mean, especially talking about boundaries with two Indian women, man, those are some hard lessons to learn, really. Who would like to go next?
Please.
Okay, thanks. Thank you so much first for your insights and for the moderation discussion. So I wanted to ask a question on how do you deal with people that, in your opinion, are toxic in your work environment, but are gaslighting you by saying you are the toxic person. So I think you might have answered a bit in the previous question, but if you can develop a bit on that.
Damn. So, okay, so maybe I'll give my example because, okay, so when I was going through it myself, I didn't really, I didn't have a word to define it, that was toxic, right? But I knew, like, having to ask for a hall pass to go to the bathroom was like my limit, like I was like, maybe this shouldn't be, So when I wrote I did the thing where I went to a member, because it was a trade body, so, and I've worked in many trade bodies, so you're never going to know which one, I went, hey, you, have coffee with the member, and I said, hey, this is happening, and then they were like, no, it's you. And then, no, but, she's so stressed, this policy person, she's so stressed. She has so much stress, we put so much on her, and trust me, this is not about her as a gender. It's just, it's very equality there, So, one of the things that I did was start documenting for myself. And then when I started documenting myself, in conversation with colleagues, I shared that document to add print screens of emails. And so now I have a serious amount of proof. So if you plan to, get me on defamation, I have incredible amount of proof that regardless of what happens, that it's accumulated and it's a little bit empowering. So how we were talking about how sometimes you feel like you're enabling when you don't speak up. Having that documenting done together kind of helps empower you to say, hey, look, it's not me. And it's not only me, So, and in all, I mean, nobody listened. So sorry to say, in my example, nobody listened. The chairman of the board didn't care, even though I wrote a letter. I took the legal route. It didn't help. So assholes remain assholes, yeah? That's the lesson. So, sorry, I would say document as much as you can with your colleagues.
And if I can add to that, because I love to add. Another thing that can be helpful, because when you're going through this, it's really difficult to navigate because it also has a big impact on your mental health. In my case, my anxiety was really high. I was terrified constantly that I was going to lose my job. So it's also a really terrible moment to have to think rationally when you're in such an emotional space. And again, this is very dependent. You may not have access to this, but if you have colleagues you trust that you can speak with, and that will be a big part of one of the things we propose as solutions, worker-led, worker movements, starting with people in your organization, that makes a big difference. But just to say, even having other people, while people are gaslighting you, having other people in your organization who say, no, you're right, the way she spoke to you was fucked up. No, you're right, that was not okay. No, you're right, we should do something about this. That makes a big difference, because as much as someone tries to invisibilize your pain, when you have colleagues who maybe have seen it or who you can even chat about with it, and they normalize that your pain is absolutely a thing, they see it too, that can really help. And that was also the case with me, you know, when I was able to get that affirmation from people in those spaces with me, it gave me tremendous support to say, no, it's not just all in my head. Because that's something that happens, and it's a great tactic that they use against us. But this is also a gendered thing, especially for women. They always make us feel like we are too emotional. And are you sure you're not imagining that it was racist or whatever? So having people who you can speak with honestly and safely, people who have got your fucking back, that is key. And whether you have that at work or you have it outside of that, again, just having mental health support from other human beings, I think, is sometimes the first most accessible step.
So earlier you were saying in the conversation that once you have identified you are in a toxic workplace, that one of the only option left when you tried other routes, legal, etc., trade unions, might be to just leave for your own sake. What I was reflecting upon also is sometimes when you're in this work environment, it takes a lot of energy and mental space to be able to, you know, look for another job, or sometimes, you know, you don't have the possibility to just quit and not having your safety net, etc. And sometimes, I don't know, sick leave might not necessarily be the sustainable option either. So what would you say to give a bit of hope to people in this situation, or like if you have other magical tips, for instance, I don't know.
So one of the things that, okay, so I really am coming from a place of privilege, but I have been in situations where I was in a toxic work environment. I was looking desperately for jobs, like desperately, and I was just, nothing was like I was just not getting the jobs, because also like when I was interviewing, people could see what a mess I was. Like my answers were shit, you know, like, so it was just not, you know, I was just not getting anywhere. So, but this is really such a personal thing that what helped is trying to figure out creatively how I could get a job. So in Brussels, we do tend to stick with the traditional route, which is, hey, look, go to Euro-Brussels or Euroactive jobs and look for jobs. But imagine the amount of applications that come through there, right? So how do you stand out is possibly while you're going through that toxic work environment, and regardless of you're a comms person or you are a policy person or whoever, like figure out if there is something else you can do with that energy. And I, when I'm saying this, I just can, like, you know how we have been through the shit where we don't even have the mental space to do anything more. So the only thing I would say is like, just get the, like, if this person is asking X, just do it, and then spend all your rest of your energy on yourself, you know, like really get yourself to. The other thing is, I really want to tell the audience is I learned it the hard way, is that I took the legal route and then I learned it extremely late, that I should have gotten legal insurance from my bank or from like employment legal entities. And then it would have been like the minimum fee so that I wouldn't have to pay a proper lawyer. So my recommendation is, if you are in a toxic situation right now, then make that investment for yourself by getting, like, I think it's like Fortis or whoever, like these banks and these organizations have like legal services specifically for employment that you should get like the abonnement for, so that when tomorrow when you decide to take legal action, you're covered by that legal aid. So I had to learn it the hard way, so please don't. That helps.
Can I share a few things as well? Yeah, some of these questions are things that often come up when I coach clients, right? And it's hard because I always try to warn my friends and my clients, don't wait until you reach a point where you're so messed up and your mental health is so shit to leave. Because then it is like pulling yourself out of wet sand to be able to leave a situation. Because as you said, your mental health isn't good. You're going to interviews and you're not acing them, etc. So this is more of a proactive approach, and I understand that it's easy to say this now, but my advice is always try to diversify your income streams. Before I could jump to full-time freelancer, it wasn't like nothing to something. I started doing little offhand jobs here, for podcasts here, editing there. Depending on your expertise, you slowly start building little pockets of money, because the scariest thing when you have to quit is, where is the income going to come from? How am I going to pay my bills? And it's also really terrifying because you're like, what if I don't find work? That somehow building those diversified income streams, even if it's just one or two opportunities and you can reach back out to them, it helps tremendously. So when I decided there is only one way, and that is I'm leaving on burnout, whether it's by my choice or not, it was still terrifying to make that jump. But having options, having some income coming in, and again, from a very privileged point of view, having a partner who had my back and said, don't worry, you're never going to be on the street. Not all of us have that, absolutely. Having friends, having family. And I also have friends who have lost their jobs and they went couch to couch between friends. Some of us are lucky that we have better or slightly worse situations, but in moments like this, you also find out who your real friends are, right? And it's important, and that's really, really important from a mental health point of view. So many of us, and this is also very gendered, we're so afraid of being a nuisance, of telling people we're suffering or struggling. But guys, we gotta do it. How can people be good friends to you if they can't step in when you need them the most? So I catastrophize a lot. That's part of like my trauma. And yes, it could be the worst case scenario. I could be homeless under a bridge. I mean, a lot of bad things would need to happen before I get there. That's my own shit that I'm working through, right? Through therapy, etc. But knowing that I had people who had my back, worst case scenario, I could go back to India and stay with my parents. Worst case scenario, for example. Exactly.
Knowing
depending.
Indian parents, I
Actually.
just have to say, I love you, mom and dad, but
Depends, right? But use your support networks. And that's another thing, right? My general feedback for life, right, is build diversified income streams. And also, when you're struggling, it might be really scary to invest money into coaches, but you don't have to do this stuff alone. You don't have to have all of the answers, especially as a young professional. Oh my God, I wish I knew so much of this stuff, right? I wish I had access. And we do have coaches. We have more support now than we ever have had. So invest in yourself by speaking with coaches, speaking to your friends, using networks before it gets really hard. Because by the time you arrive at that really dark place, you are going to be fighting 80 times harder just to stay sane. That is not a good place to arrive at. That's my feedback.
Thank you. It's more a question of curiosity almost. I mean, I'm very privileged. I'm very happy where I work. I'm managing an amazing team, and I've been managed by amazing people. So I don't have any kind of imminent issues myself in my personal life. Also because I'm a white man, I'm doing fine. But I have still observed different patterns of toxic behavior from bosses. Again, luckily, often not affecting myself, but affecting people I've worked with. I've also recognized situations where afterwards I have regretted, not speaking up or not going to the person asking, "Are you okay?" or that was not okay. I'm in a constant improvement situation. But nonetheless, to get to the point, I think I've observed some differences in toxicity that's maybe a bit generation linked as well. So you have bosses, who are in their, late 50s, early 50s, to you have bosses who are these young and dynamic people, mid 30s, late 40s, like myself, and they might be toxic in different ways, toxic for different reasons. Have you noticed any patterns yourselves, and can you comment on that, or? Yeah.
So, yes, absolutely. The one thing that I have noticed is when people, like you're mentioning, of a older generation, when they think of themselves and call out that people are being ageist again towards them because they are older, so now they must get a consulting contract because they're too expensive or whatever. So a lot of time, and I've had this conversation openly on LinkedIn to say, I'm sorry, but it's karma's a bitch, because how you treated young people when interns were coming into your organizations and saying your different way of doing things didn't matter, or your hard work of back in the day making like copies for people, that was not an important pillar of your organization, is coming back to you. So you're absolutely right, is that, and I say this because I'm smack in the middle of like the young and the old, but I think it's for all of us to remember that we were young and how we felt treated when we were younger and the kind of duties we were given. It's really old school now. Like that whole thing that we do these days that, oh, you're this age group, so now you're qualified to be a senior manager. Come on, like we're in Western Europe, and that bit that where we do is that, oh, now I'm older, so I should only have management positions. And that's what I talk about in A Better Brussels, is that management is not a mandate. It's a choice. So please, like as young professionals, we should ask ourselves the question, do I want to be a people manager? Because being a people manager is so much about letting go of yourself and letting go of your needs and really taking care of and putting your team first and making sure your team does this best. So to answer your question, yes, I've seen it where the older generations would say things like, oh, there's ageism and there's ageism. And I always, like I have said this publicly, like I mentioned on LinkedIn, to say, I'm sorry, but you were really ageist towards the incoming class of people. So now it's just like, I'm sorry to say, but that's the case. But it's also a lesson for us, like the middle people, age group people, where we are eventually going to be that age group, and we have to ask ourselves, did we do it right by the young professionals that are coming in? Especially in today's day and age where power is shifting, Europe is trying to figure out where it sits on a global stage. And we as middle managers, can we say things like, I want Europe to be known for this. Like I want, for all the preaching that we do from the Brussels space to pan-European, like pan-European, all the other member states, I would love to get our ducks in order right here in Brussels. Like, let's do this right. And then let's preach like beyond. So that's my answer to your question.
That was a great question. Some reflections. I don't know if I can necessarily say so clearly, but you have to be in person because we need to see that you are being productive. Seems like to be, it's maybe it's across many generations of leaders, but I really think this is the outdated concept. We have all been forced to work at home. If you really need to see your team constantly in the office, I think you need to question yourself why. Because trust me, you could be in the office where, for 40 hours and do nothing. Like, there is no guarantee at all that you need, that you're going to do quality work. Another thing in terms of like generations or groups is this assumption that if you're a young person, you are an influencer or you know how to do social media. I mean, probably you are. I don't know. I mean, I'm not that generation, but this expectation that if you come in as a young professional, especially Gen Z or Gen Alpha already, I don't know, that you need to be an expert and you need to take control of all of the social media. Whether that's part of your job description or not, that's a bit ridiculous. And I would even flip the question the other way, which is super interesting because I've heard this a lot because I'm in that generation of people who are managing younger generations, which is like there are new challenges with managing our younger generations, our Gen Zs, etc. And on one hand, I'm very proud of, and this is a broad generalization, but I'm very proud of Gen Z for not putting up with our shit. Because it was the same. I don't put up with the same shit my parents put up with, and I'm glad that the younger generation puts up with less shit than I put up with. And I hope that in some ways that continues to happen. But we also have to be conscious that different generations have different expectations. And, instead of us asking and trying to second guess, oh, what do young people want these days? Talk to them. Ask them. When I manage younger people, I mean, I loved seeing it. One of the persons I managed who I love, she would just be like, Gail, I want to learn this and also I want to do that. And I'd also at some point like to get there and there. I'm like, who's managing who here? Like, you know what you want, girl. And I love that for you. And it made me a better manager because she was clear about her expectations. So empower the young people around you to give you the responses that you need to be a better manager. And one final thing that's sort of related and not is another way that you can be a good advocate for the people in your team, whether you're in management or not, is if you see problematic practices like unpaid interns or low-paid interns, which is, again, something that in a very well-established organization was happening, it doesn't matter whether they are working with you or not. Speak up for it. If you don't speak up for things like this, don't you wish people had spoken up when you were in situations like that? So do unto others as you wish had been done to you. Seems very biblical, and I apologize for that. I guess you can't take the Christianity away from me, but yeah, those are some fine ones. Thanks for the great question.